point is that it's because it reminds us about the controversy around formulating sexual rights and reproductive rights as part of the corpus of human rights. It is because there is always political opposition to framing matters related to sexuality and reproduction as rights. It is understood by conservative constituencies as a euphemism for LGBTIQA rights, abortion rights, gender identity rights, and so on. So the drafting itself of Article 25 gives away that even for a progressive convention as the Cprd, nonetheless, it was not possible to spell out explicitly the notion of sexual and reproductive rights. Rather, it was agreed that the best way forward would be to convey it and package it as part and parcel of sexual and reproductive health. But we need not really despair that this was not achieved at the drafting of the convention. We need not despair that sexual and reproductive rights are not spelled out clearly, and this is because we work with a holistic notion of health, which was developed initially by the World Health Organization, and we know that health is not merely the absence of infirmity or disease, but rather it is the well-being of the person that matters in a holistic sense. So we can think of health as physical, mental, and social well-being. And this allows us a window through which to discuss sexual and reproductive rights. I think this is an important point to mention because in the African region, we work with governments that are generally conservative in their orientation and generally against the idea of being seen as having purchase in the rights that are now very fully developed in the global north. So part of how we negotiate that tension, part of how we ensure that we also promote the human rights of Africans in the sexuality and in the reproductive rights sphere is to maximally utilize provisions that talk about health. And if you look at the Maputo Protocol, that's basically what it does. In Article 14, it uses health as a concept for also including sexual and reproductive rights. So I'm hoping that as we interrogate the topic of this year's conference, we will be able to contextualize, we will be able to domesticate and to regionalize how we can talk about sexual and reproductive rights in the African regions by using strategies that give us a maximum prospect of succeeding before our governments. Because to simply advocate for rights when it appears that you have not thought about the legislature, you have not thought about the policymakers, you have not thought about what the courts will say, means that you can end up with empty rights. So we need to think very carefully how we can formulate these rights, how we can talk about them in a way that they are understood not just by our elites, but also by the grassroots. So I said to you, prepare yourself to be challenged, excited, and inspired by the discussions in this conference. Before I hand over back to Diana, our moderator, once again, I would like to say on behalf of the Center for Human Rights, welcome to the conference. It's wonderful that you're all here, even though we're not meeting in person. I'm sure that we will have a productive discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ngwena, for those wonderful words of welcome as well from you. I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, and our keynote speaker is Ms. Fatma Wangare Haji. She is the current Regional Coordinator for Inclusion Africa and Project Director on Access to Justice at the Kenya Association of the Intellectually Handicapped, in short, KAI. Fatma is a mother to a daughter with an intellectual disability. She has worked in the disability movement for over 15 years. She serves on the board of the Kenya Network of Women and Girls with Disabilities, which is a platform that brings over 14 organizations working on women with disability rights in the country. She's also a member of the Inclusion International Catalyst for Inclusive Education Africa Response Team, and also serves in the advisory panel of the Disability Inclusive Climate Action Research Program, known in short as DCOP. She lives and works with a simple philosophy of change starts with me. This is embedded on strong values of human dignity and respect, exceeding expectations and experiencing the world through the eyes of persons with intellectual disabilities, and empowering others to really understand what disability is, array their fears that it is not contagious and it is not also a myth, but a reality in our society. It is my pleasure to welcome Ms. Fatma Wangare Haji to give us a keynote address.
Yep. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. First of all,
just a little bit, madam. Am I visible enough?
Yes.
I'm just checking. Oh, yes. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you very much, madam.
Okay. Yeah, so first of all, I would like to express my gratitude to the event organizers and every other being responsible for granting me this opportunity to issue a keynote address for this year's conference themed Realizing the Sexual and Reproductive Rights of Persons with Disabilities in the African Region, the Promise of Disability Rights Treaties. It is such a humbling occasion, especially because we are speaking of rights and justice, which are two delicate elements of any known administrative system globally. I believe that order in society is attained when rights are observed, and that equality is only achieved when the rights of the most left behind members of the society, such as persons with disabilities, are assured. At this year's conference, we are handling two crucial perspectives on our quest to fight for the rights of persons with disabilities in the African region. The first perspective is the general realization of their sexual and reproductive health rights, while the second perspective is more specific as it narrows down to the promise of the Disability Rights Treaties. As of now, we are all aware that the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is the landmark international treaty concerned with the championing of human rights of persons with disabilities. Currently, there are 182 ratifications to the Crpd and 96 ratifications to its optional protocols. What do these numbers tell us? Well, they imply that the world is on its way towards fully being obligated towards upholding the rights of persons with disabilities fully. I believe that the gaps encountered in the realization of the full rights of persons with disabilities are the primary reason for the convention of these promises. However, we ought to be careful to avoid losing the plot with generalization. Fundamentally, we are here specifically to address the sexual and reproductive health rights of persons with disabilities. Before we progress, it will be necessary to understand the growing interest in sexual and reproductive health rights. Article 25, Part A, which Professor Ngwena has already read, I wouldn't want to repeat, but really talks about access to same range quality services, affordable services, and programs on sexual and reproductive health and population-based health programs on an equal basis with others. While Article 23 of the Convention talks about the right to family, and therefore it touches matters pertaining to marriage, family, parenthood, relationships, fertility, access to information and sexual and reproductive health services, and freedom from exploitation and abuse. However, we need to develop an interest in the specifics to realize these sexual and reproductive rights fully. Remember that sexual and reproductive health injustices cases are uniquely remote with regards to the scenarios in which they occur. And this necessitates the customization of the general provisions of the convention to fit the specific cases. A concerned focus towards understanding the realization of sexual and reproductive rights in Africa would imply that we analyze how far we have come, where we are, and where we are going. Perhaps a progress report regarding how far Africa has realized the assurance of these rights is an essential starting point to understand the promises of the treaties. Primarily, Africa has been at the forefront in providing for the rights of persons with disabilities, as highlighted by the African Union's Declaration of 1999 to 2009, and 2010 to 2019 as African Decades for Persons with Disabilities. In its 2010-2019 Declaration for Persons with Disabilities, there is the provision requiring member states to combat sexual violence against women and girls with disabilities by encouraging the Special Rapporteur on Women's Rights in Africa or another appropriate body to undertake investigation and issue reports. Additionally, the provision requires member states to ensure access to sexual and reproductive health rights services, for women and girls with disabilities. Most recently, there was the adoption of the Africa Disability Protocol on the 29th January 2018 in Addis Ababa. The protocol has two specific articles that touch on sexual and reproductive health rights. Article 17 talks about right to health and very specifically has some subsections on sexual and reproductive rights, while Article 27 of the Africa Disability Protocol talks about women and girls with disabilities. Article 27J, therefore, talks about the right to protecting women and girls with disabilities from sexual and gender-based violence, and that they're provided with rehabilitation and psychosocial support against sexual and gender-based violence. And Article 27K says that, whereby the sexual and reproductive health rights of women with disabilities need to be guaranteed, and that women with disabilities be granted the right to retain and control their fertility and are not sterilized without their consent. But is this the case really in our communities? So in CAI, we implement a project on sexual and reproductive health rights for girls and women with disabilities. And a research that we did revealed that almost 50 girls that we interviewed had been, sterilized without their consent. Quite a number of issues here to look at. Is it the family? Is it the health system? What does the girl say in all this? So I think more and more as we go through these discussions, we really need to interrogate. Where are the challenges? How do we address these challenges? It is also worth noting that the provisions of the Crpd and the Africa Disability Protocol act as promises. In a sense, take the example of a law of contract. Within it, some elements stipulate how parties to the contract ought to conduct themselves while transacting. Essentially, the provisions of the law of contract act as the guiding principle that they promise, in quotes, to provide remedies to the contracting parties in the event of a default. In the same way, the provisions of the Crpd and the Africa Disability Protocol holds member states accountable to persons with disabilities and their respective organizations. In this regard, member states becoming signatories and ratifying the Africa Disability Protocol promise to uphold its provisions in ensuring that the rights of persons with disabilities are granted to them as obligated. As we advance with seamless integration of the treaties on the rights of persons with disabilities, while following the guidelines of interest bodies such as the World Health Organization, would be a crucial step in the right direction towards ensuring that the sexual and reproductive health of persons with disabilities is realized in Africa. For instance, WHO notes that persons with disabilities have poorer health outcomes because of their experiences of neglect, abuse, and discrimination. Additionally, many health workers contribute to this situation because of their negative attitudes or lack of knowledge and skills in supporting people with disabilities. However, health workers are responsible for working together with persons with disabilities and their respective organizations to uphold their sexual and reproductive health rights. UNAIDS and the World Bank recommend that governments train health workers to be able to enforce the rights of persons with disabilities. From WHO's findings, it is evident that the bottleneck towards ensuring the implementation of treaty promises is found within healthcare systems. As a guide, WHO recommends that the inclusion of persons with disabilities and their respective organizations in planning and decision-making about service planning and delivering is quite critical in challenging negative values and attitudes of health workers. Taking on an advocacy role in partnership with organizations of persons with disabilities in outreach work to ensure the sexual and reproductive health rights of persons with disabilities are fully realized. Before I conclude the keynote address, I would like to reiterate on an important aspect regarding implementation that has almost become a song with regards to the African region. The aspect is this: in Africa, it is said that we are good at policy formulation and that the main challenge we have is in the execution of the formidable policies, which then become only good on paper, but amount nothing in reality. We are then held up in the perception versus reality bottleneck concerning policy implementation. It is with this respect that I would like to issue a rallying call that even as we discuss, share experiences and initiatives that many actors are implementing on sexual and reproductive rights in Africa, we should concert our efforts also to push for the full implementation of the Maputo Protocol with a specific lens on the full inclusion of women and girls with disabilities. Additionally, having only 9 AU member states that have become signatories to the Africa Disability Protocol, with no one state that has ratified it, highlights the need for more member states to understand that there's an urgent need for the prioritization on the rights of persons with disabilities, and therefore they should rally the administrative systems and resources to concentrate on the ratification of the protocol. It is only then that the sexual and reproductive rights of persons with disabilities in Africa will be realized. Thank you very much for your kind attention, and I trust that this conference will be a great success. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Fatma Wangari Haji, for those keynote comments. We are so grateful to you for having made the time to be with us this morning. So at this juncture, we are now transitioning to the substantive part of the proceedings, where we will have our first session of the conference, which is titled Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights for Persons with Disabilities in Africa, Setting the Scene. And moderating this session is my colleague, Mr. Paul Juma, who is a program officer here in the Disability Rights Unit at the Center for Human Rights. And he's also a Doctor of Laws candidate at the Center for Human Rights. Paul, I will now hand over to you to moderate our first substantive session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diana. Good morning, everyone. I will be moderating the session, which is on sexual and reproductive health and rights for persons with disabilities in Africa, setting the scene. In this session, we will be discussing the sexual and reproductive health challenges affecting persons with disabilities in Africa. We have two speakers for this session. The first speaker is Dr. Xanthe Hunt. Dr. Hunt is a senior global health researcher at the Institute for Life Course Health Research in the Department of Global Health at Stellenbosch University and a consultant to the World Health Organization in Geneva and London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Her topic is on the myth of a sexuality, disability stigma as a barrier to sexual relationships in South Africa. She will present on Article 25 of the United Nations Conventions on the Right of Persons with Disabilities, while emphasizing the need for government parties to recognize sexual and reproductive health of persons with disabilities. Her talk will reflect on research conducted in South Africa between 2015 and 2019 with the aim of shedding light on the state of sexual and reproductive health and rights among people with disabilities. The second speaker in this session is Ms. Judith Murungi. Ms. Judith Murungi has worked at the O'Neill Institute for National and Global Health Law. She is currently pursuing her Masters of Laws at the University of Nairobi. She is also an advocate of the High Court of Kenya and a legal researcher passionate about human rights and health law. Her topic is on physical disabilities, sexuality, and reproductive autonomy. She will talk about the foundation of the right to health and reproductive autonomy under international law. She will give an analysis of the state of affairs on this right in various countries across Africa, with specific reference to East African countries, namely Uganda and Kenya. The session will take exactly 1 hour from now. Speakers have 20 minutes each to make their presentations. Then afterwards, we will take a few questions. Feel free to raise questions on the chat box, which we will then read out to our presenters at the end of their presentations. So without any further ado, I wish to welcome the first speaker, who is Dr. Hunt, to make her presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paul. I just would like to quickly check that I am clearly audible to everyone. So if Paul, if you don't mind being the person to say if that's the case.
Yes, you are audible enough.
Okay,
Dr.
great. Thank you. And then if it would be possible for the host to enable screen sharing, I've got a couple of slides that are going to guide us through the session. So Sabia, maybe if you could let me know when that's possible. Wonderful. Okay, well, I trust that my slides are large on everyone's screen. Today, as introduced by Paul, I'm going to be discussing the role of kind of the societal context.
Just a second, madam. Am I visible?
I don't know that you're pinned anymore, but I can see you, although that's not the point. Sabia, is the sign language interpretation visible to everyone else as a pinned image?
Yes, yes. The sign is visible.
Thanks,
Oh, great.
Paul. Great. So the emphasis of this talk is really going to be on the social context in which sexuality is experienced for people with disabilities, and particularly look at the South African context and what we found in our research here. So while we know that sexuality is obviously something that is embodied and it is experienced as very personal, it's also something which takes place and is experienced in a kind of ecological context. And what I want to talk about today is the role that the attitudes of the kind of broader society, and particularly people without disabilities, how those attitudes might affect the lived experience of sexuality and access to sexual and reproductive health care in quite concrete ways for people with disabilities in South Africa. And this talk focuses on people with physical disabilities, but I think that there's some sort of broader learnings which can be generalized. So where we're going to go today is I'm going to speak a little bit about why. So why did we look at physical disability and sexuality in this research? And then I'm going to discuss a little bit what we knew before we started this research. So what's some of the other findings from other contexts could lead us to believe and why this might be an important topic. And then I'm going to take you through sort of findings over the course of 4 years in 2 different projects, and what we found in terms of myths and misconceptions about sexuality amongst people with disabilities. And then we're going to look a little bit at the lived experience of sex and sexual and reproductive health care and sexual relationships amongst a smallish sample of people with physical disabilities in South Africa. And then towards the end of the talk, I'm going to try and hold those 2 different bodies of work in conversation with one another, and try and point out what we can learn if we look at the social context and people's lived experience, and how those either are kind of working optimally or kind of butting up against one another to the detriment of the well-being of people with disabilities. So as I think has been really well outlined in this course, there are a lot of international consensus documents which enshrine the rights of people with disabilities to enjoy not only sexual and reproductive health care access, but I think increasingly sexual citizenship. And that concept is sort of variously defined, but it basically equates to being seen as a sexual being in the context of your society in a way which allows you to access sexual rights and access the kinds of supports that you need in terms of education or healthcare, access to relationships and social spaces, which allows you to live out your kind of sexual identity without any infringements from others. So given this context, that we have these consensus documents that state that this is something that's really important, if you then go and look at the research literature, you find that these rights, which are enshrined, are largely documented to be infringed upon in one way or another. And there sort of initially was anecdotal evidence, and then some larger scale surveys and studies which have shown that sexual rights are infringed upon for people with disabilities, and that the evidence that there was from the African context shows that this takes various forms. But we'll get to that in a little bit in the next slide. But that the general consensus is that these rights are not being accessed, and that there are a variety of different barriers. We also have sort of a range of evidence that people with different types of impairments experience different challenges. And so this particular project was concerned with people with physical disabilities and their experiences and the kinds of barriers that they might encounter. But just to note that that is only one kind of slice of the pie, it's only one piece of the picture. And that's the focus here, but that there may be other sort of specific barriers that are encountered by people with other types of impairments. So what we knew before from the international literature, and when I say the international literature, I mean we're part of international, we are part of the globe, but when the international literature is very heavily skewed towards high income context, right? So you have that 90-10% of what is known as from or 90% of what is known as from 10% of the world's population. So a lot of the evidence on sexual and reproductive healthcare access and experiences was from populations in high income countries. But what that research suggested is that people with physical disabilities are encountering barriers to living fully sexual and sexually healthy lives. And that one of those barriers was in the attitudes of people without disabilities. And one particular sort of thing that recurred through a lot of the literature, where researchers had gone to people with disabilities and asked them, what kind of attitudes have you encountered? And research where people had gone to people without disabilities and said, what are the attitudes that you hold? Was that people without disabilities negate the sexuality of people with physical disabilities. And this was seen in the international literature in terms of sort of the general population, so every woman, but also in terms of healthcare providers, and that these attitudes were really pervasive and impacting on the lived experience and access to healthcare of people with physical disabilities. But there really wasn't a lot of research from low and middle income contexts. And while we have reason to believe that there might be some overlaps, because attitudes, although they show a lot of variation between contexts, there often are some quite common themes. But we didn't have that specificity. So what does this look like? Do these beliefs exist in South Africa? So do we have sort of societal stigma? And is that creating challenges for people with physical disabilities? But also, are there particular sort of aspects of the context that shape what these attitudes or these myths and misconceptions might look like? And so that's really what this research all set out to try and understand. A little bit on the methods, so how we set out to answer these different questions. We had 2 studies over the course of 4 years. So in the first, we did a really large-scale survey, so about 2,000 respondents, where we asked South Africans without disabilities what they thought about a range of things to do with the sexuality and sexual and reproductive health of people with disabilities. And I'll explore that a little bit when we get to the findings, what those items and questions look like and what the survey looked like. But then we also had a photo voice study with people with lived experience of physical disability who were living in South Africa in the Western Cape, to try and understand in the social context that the survey was designed to illuminate, what are their lived experiences? And we used photo voice to understand that, because we were interested in how a sort of creative methodology where you take photos to represent your experience could illuminate some of the things that can be quite hard to talk about when we think about sexuality and sexual experience. In the second study, which happened later, we sort of did a deep dive into women's experiences. So the initial study had shown that women encounter a very unique set of challenges and barriers. And we wanted to understand that a little bit better. So it was an in-depth kind of qualitative exploration with women in Khayelitsha, where I work. And we really focused on adjustment to acquired impairments. So it was a group of women who had acquired a physical impairment sort of later in life. And we wanted to understand if they reflected on their experience prior to acquiring an impairment and the experience after acquiring an impairment, if they were able to illuminate any kind of reflections about how the sort of society's reactions to them had changed over time. But we also asked a lot of more general questions about relationships, access to healthcare, and importantly, experiences of violence and sexual violence. Now, in terms of the myths and misconceptions, which I think is the kind of starting point of this talk, and it's the main contribution I'm meant to make, is that there are a lot of quite negative misconceptions held amongst people without disabilities in South Africa about the sexual and reproductive healthcare rights and experiences of people with disabilities. So we had 1,990 survey respondents, and when we asked them, what do you think is the sort of capacity to express sexuality of people with physical disabilities. And then later in the survey, we asked them the exact same question, but we asked them for just everyone. They consistently and significantly, so there's a significant difference if you did a statistical test on it, estimated the capacity to express sexuality, whether sexuality was a human right, and whether people had the right to have children, as lower amongst people with physical disabilities. Now, the estimation of the right to have children was not a significant difference, but in terms of capacity to express sexuality and seeing sexuality as a basic human right, there were very large and significant differences in their estimation of these different rights amongst people with disabilities and people without disabilities. Interestingly, people without disabilities also estimated that people with physical disabilities didn't use sexual and reproductive healthcare services as much as they did. And that kind of points again to a negation of the need to use those services amongst people with disabilities. We also had some sort of different and kind of, I guess, creative ways of trying to access these beliefs. So when you do research on stigma, you often find that if you ask people outright, do you think this mean thing, then they'll say they don't. And so, but if you give them a scenario which allows them to project that belief elsewhere, then it can be quite revealing. And so we had the scenario, and depending on the gender and sexual orientation of the respondent, the scenario changed. But I'll read you the one which was given to women, heterosexual women. It says, Jane, who is non-disabled, meets John, who has a physical disability, at a party. They have a nice chat together and they seem to be getting along. And at the end of the evening, John tells Jane that he really likes her and he invites her to go out the following weekend. And then we asked them, how does Jane react to John? How much she responds to him? The idea here is that the respondent to the survey will kind of interject to the role of Jane in this response. What we found was that the respondents largely portrayed the situation going quite poorly for John, or the person with a physical disability in this scenario. So for instance, they'd say the non-disabled person goes out with the person with a physical disability for one date out of sympathy for him, but unfortunately doesn't return his calls afterwards. So as you can see, the respondents to the survey got quite creative in their envisioning of the end of the scenario, but not in a way which is, I guess, optimal. They also said things like, if the conversation and the person with a physical disability's company were exceptional, then the non-disabled person would certainly react positively and respond with the affirmative. But if not, she can reserve her right to refuse the invitation. So this is, obviously, you do have the right to refuse an invitation if it's a romantic one. But what was interesting is in the first part of this response is the insistence that a person with a physical disability, in order to be kind of seen as an equal partner, needs to actually overperform. And this was something that recurred throughout the findings, was the idea that in order to somehow compensate for having a physical disability, romantic partners would need to behave in a way which was kind of exceptional. The final response, which I'll shed light on, is that this person said there might be a deal breaker in terms of disabilities, as if she is paralyzed from the waist down and she wants someone sexually active, then he wouldn't want to date her, but at least they would be friends. And so again, it was reflective of kind of a stigmatizing attitude towards sexuality amongst people with physical disability, but also a gross misunderstanding of what represents and what constitutes sexual relationships and satisfying relationships, and also of the capacity to engage in those kinds of relationships amongst people with physical disabilities. We also found a lot of evidence of very prominent stereotypes, right? So we asked a bunch of questions, sort of off the top of your head, what 5 words spring to mind if you think about men, just generally. And then they would say sort of the usual things that people say about men that are stereotypical. And then later in the survey, we asked, what are the sort of 5 things that spring to mind when you think about men with physical disabilities? What was interesting is that there were unfortunately a lot of negative stereotypes about men with physical disabilities and women with physical disabilities, but also that where you see a very stereotypical difference between the stereotypes that people hold about men and women broadly. So they're very, very different. It'll be things like women are shy and kind and nurturing, and men are strong and aloof and, you know, I don't know, something else. When you looked at the stereotypes that are held about people with physical disabilities, they weren't differentiated by gender. And so that kind of points that there's a desexualization and a degendering of people with physical disabilities, that people without disabilities are seeing the disability first and the gender as kind of secondary. And so the gender didn't really come up in the stereotypes that they held. We also did see a lot of use of terms like that reflected an estimation of a lack of sexuality on the part of people with physical disabilities. Finally, and very, very briefly, when we did the sort of deep dive in Kailicha about women's lived experience, what we found is that sexuality is seen as strongly connected to romantic love, relationships, being a family, building a family, and being a mother, but that women were aware of the social context and the kinds of negative beliefs that pervaded, and that affected their own confidence going into relationships because they thought that men might see them in these limited and limiting ways. We also encountered that women spoke about sort of having negative interactions with the healthcare system, with healthcare workers who underestimated their capacity to be sexual beings and were surprised when they were pregnant or went in for contraception. But that also socialization had been largely limiting. And so women had encountered from a very young age kind of attitudes and perspectives from their caregivers, which said that they shouldn't expect to fulfill these typical roles in society as a mother or a partner, a girlfriend or a wife, because of their impairments. And that's important because when we think about how to address these things, it's really important to understand how early these kinds of influences might happen. I'm aware of the time, so I'm going to skip through a few more of the findings. But one thing that was interesting is that we found that amongst men, the kind of performative aspects of sexuality were really important, is that they thought that in order, and again, sort of echoing that expectation amongst people without disabilities, that people with disabilities should somehow perform to compensate. We found that men with physical disabilities were aware of that, and so really worried about their ability to perform as a man in a relationship in a variety of different ways. In general, what we found is that these kind of societal attitudes pervade everyone's experiences. And for instance, if you think about healthcare workers are, after all, just members of a society. And so they very often, consciously or unconsciously, will take on kind of the dominant set of beliefs. And so what we found is that women, particularly with disabilities, had encountered negative attitudes from healthcare providers. Similarly, in terms of the kinds of stereotypes that we found, people with disabilities were aware of that, and it impacted their own experience of relationships, their confidence in relationships, and very importantly, led to a kind of distrust and reluctance to access services when they needed it. And that included in respect of sexual violence. And so we had women who had reported experiencing sexual violence, experiencing intimate partner violence, but being anxious of the stigmatizing attitudes of support workers. And so not wanting to disclose what had happened and not accessing the necessary supports. So very briefly, we think that some of the directions that this leads us in is to recognize the need for better, more inclusive sexual and reproductive health education, particularly in schools and for the caregivers of young children with disabilities. We really need to strengthen education for mainstream service providers. So not just specialists. Specialists often know this is their area. They may have the greater access to knowledge and learning, but it's the frontline healthcare workers who people with physical disabilities are encountering on a daily basis who we really need to equip to respond appropriately to their needs. And finally, I think what's really important is representation. So normalizing the sexuality and the sexual and reproductive healthcare needs and experiences of people with disabilities, particularly in media and in platforms, I think, like this, where it can hopefully over time lead to attitude change. I'm going to stop presenting now because I believe that my time is up. And I think hand back to Paul.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Hunt, for your presentation. What we got from that presentation, we learned how the sexual rights of persons with disabilities are infringed in Africa, the barriers to sexual rights for persons with disabilities, and also Dr. Hunt took us through the findings on their study, which revealed the myths and misconceptions on capacity of people with disabilities to express their sexuality. She also provided the solutions to this, which are better education on sexual and health rights for persons with disabilities. Now, the next speaker is Ms. Judith Murungi. Welcome.
I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you're audible.
Thank you. My name is Judith Murungi. I am presenting a topic on physical disabilities, sexuality, and reproductive autonomy. I'll give an introduction. Firstly, we see that in African societies, most people with physical disabilities do not have access to sufficient sexual and reproductive healthcare information, and there are barriers in regard to access to reproductive healthcare for persons with disabilities. So there is need for us to realize reproductive autonomy for persons living with physical disabilities, and that is the gist of my discussion today. It is estimated that 15% of the world's population lives with disabilities, and this does not disqualify them from similar sexual and reproductive health needs as other people. Overall, the sexual reproductive health needs of persons with physical disabilities are neglected, and there's also the challenge of the difficulty in accessing the services that they need. I'm going to address the right to sexuality and reproductive autonomy. And sexual and reproductive rights are fundamental human rights. They embrace human rights that are already recognized in international, regional, and national legal frameworks, standards, or agreements. They encompass the right to autonomy and self-determination. This involves the ability of a party to make informed decisions and to have control over their body, sexuality and reproductive matters, and to access sexual reproductive health care, and to basically be able to decide what they want to do in regard to their sexuality. The Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, under Article 1, it provides that its purpose is to promote, protect, and ensure the full enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms by all persons with disabilities, and to promote respect for their inherent dignity. So persons with disabilities include those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments, which in interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. Under this under this convention, Article 3 outlines the general principles, and the general principles include respect for inherent dignity, individual autonomy, including the freedom to make one's choices, and independence of persons. It further provides for non-discrimination, full and effective participation and inclusion in society, respect for difference and acceptance of persons with disabilities as part of human diversity and humanity. It also provides for equality of opportunity, accessibility, equality between men and women, and respect for the evolving capacities of children with disabilities, and respect for the right of children with disabilities to preserve their identities. In line with that, there is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which is known as the Sedo Convention. The Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women is a major international treaty that protects the right of women to make their own decisions about their fertility and sexuality. The convention provides that states are obliged to take all appropriate measures to eliminate all forms of discrimination amongst women. And this also encompasses lack of reproductive health services and education. So this convention points to the need for policymakers, governments, and service providers to ensure that fertility regulation and reproductive health services are tailored in a manner that will empower women and not as a means to limit population growth or any other thing. So this provides for inclusivity, even including people living with physical disabilities, just to ensure that they're able to enjoy and exercise their reproductive rights and fundamental freedoms. So it's with this view that we believe that if these provisions in such conventions are upheld, we will have a scenario whereby all women, regardless of whether they have physical disabilities or not, will have their sexual and reproductive rights fully realized. Looking at the ratification status of the Crpd in Kenya and Uganda. In Kenya, it was ratified on 19th May 2018. And under the Constitution of Kenya, under Article 26, there are provisions that Kenya recognizes international law, and it's under this ambit that this convention is considered. Article 33(2) of the convention requires state parties to designate an important mechanism to promote, protect, and monitor the implementation of the convention. Article 33(2) requires that civil society, in particular, persons with disabilities and their representative organizations are involved and participate fully in the monitoring process. So in terms of implementation of the Cprd in Kenya, there's been established the National Commission on Human Rights, which was designated as the first monitoring agency of the convention in February 2011. The monitoring mandate was then vested in the National Gender and Equality Commission in 2014. And it has played a very significant role in ensuring that there's monitoring of this convention. And it has played a significant role, and various researchers have also carried out a lot of research in regard to promotion of the rights of persons with disabilities. And it has been carried out in various counties, and various studies are showing how there are existing challenges in implementing this law as it is. So looking at the status of the Cprd in Uganda, in 2006, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities was adopted by the UN General Assembly, and it was open for signature in March 2007. Consequently, Ugandan government signed the Cprd in March 2007. In 2008, it was ratified and its optional protocol. In 2016, the Committee on the Cprd considered the initial report of Uganda and recommended, among others, that Uganda harmonizes definitions of disability in various laws and policies, reviews all legislation, and brings it into line with the convention. There are various acts that have been in place in regard to responding to disability rights in Uganda. And there was the National Council for Disability Act in 2003, which laid down the function of the council, which was aiming at protecting the rights of people with disabilities. And then more to that, there have been significant moves whereby we've seen governments at the local government level being able to formulate district ordinances for implementing the Crpd in their respective districts. There are some examples like Iganga and Wakiso. And this has been done through conducting baseline survey on the situation of persons with disabilities in the district, analyzing the existing legal framework in the district, and also being able to have ways in which they can translate those provisions into local languages so that those people in those districts are able to understand what this law says and what the importance of keeping or maintaining what it states is important. So that's a very important move. You can see that there's a further translation of these provisions and a way of linking with people at community level and trying to explain to them what it is. And further to that, there have been other acts in Uganda like the Persons with Disabilities Act of 2020, and it's an act to provide for respect and promotion of fundamental and other human rights and freedoms of persons with disabilities. It establishes the National Council for Disability as the council, and it also basically attends to the rights of persons with disabilities. Under Section 4 of the Act, it provides for the right to enjoy family life. A person with disability has a right to a home, to found a family, adopt, and be a guardian or trustee of a child. They are entitled to have sexual and other intimate relationships, equal rights at marriage, during marriage, at its dissolution, to raise his or her child and not to be separated from their family, except in accordance with the law and in the best interest of the child. Section 5 of the Act provides for prohibition of inhumane and degrading treatment for persons with disabilities. A person with disabilities will not be subjected to any form of torture or to any activity without their free and informed consent. They are not supposed to be subjected to medical or scientific research, harmful traditional or cultural practices, or for sterilization. And Section 7 further provides for non-discrimination in the provision of health services. So with these kind of provisions in existing laws, you can see that these countries are making a move towards ensuring that there is legislation that is shielding the rights of persons living with disabilities and also upholding their autonomy. Now, in this, there are also barriers to the rights to sexuality and reproductive autonomy. Disabled people continue to face these barriers. Some are structural and others are attitudinal while seeking reproductive autonomy. So structural barriers, some of them include the fact that it is difficult for them to access healthcare. As we know our health systems, we have seen that it is even difficult for people who are normal to access health services. It even now gets more worse for persons living with disabilities when they attempt to access healthcare and health services in such facilities that are already failing for people without disabilities. So reproductive health and health rights violations include physical and information barriers to accessing information, and children and adolescents living with disabilities are often excluded or denied access to sexuality education programs due to the existence of the assumption that they do not need such information. Sometimes this information is structured in a way that leaves out people living with disabilities. When people are addressing students or adolescents about sexuality, you rarely find an address that is all-encompassing to include adolescents who are living with disabilities, as though they are not entitled to exercising their rights. And then we look at equipment and facilities in hospitals that are designed in a manner that does not accommodate people living with disabilities. Oftentimes, healthcare services are available, but there are also barriers which may be financial, social or psychological, in accessing adequate reproductive health care. This is also showing that there's a difficulty in access to these services. There's discrimination in sexual reproductive health care delivery towards persons living with disabilities. There are health workers that demonstrate a level of lack of sensitivity and courtesy while dealing with women and girls with disabilities. And this is attributed to the fact that some of these health care workers do not have the appropriate training. They don't have the appropriate evidence-based training on how to handle persons living with disabilities. There's also a misconception that persons living with disabilities are asexual. And therefore, these misconceptions lead to denying them information on HIV/AIDS, sexually transmitted infections, or any other thing that is related to sexual reproductive health care rights. There's discrimination and stigma around pregnancy and motherhood for persons living with disabilities, and women with disabilities are subjected to substandard care, including discrimination and abusive treatment as they access maternal and newborn health care services. So these are some of the hindrances that they encounter in accessing prenatal and antenatal health care services. People living with disabilities also have difficulty in sharing their stories. There are hardly enough platforms for them to share their stories or their perspectives. They are not consulted fully in terms of laws and policies, and there is lack of meaningful participation when it comes to them. And that is a very big loophole, because at the end of the day, we ask ourselves, how are we able to legislate for them when we do not include them? And in line with this, there was a philosopher named Susan Wendell, who said she was suffering from chronic fatigue syndrome. And she said that if we tell people about her pain, for example, we remind them of the existence of pain, the imperfection and fragility of their body, the possibility of their own pain, the inevitability of it, they may want to believe that they are not like us, not vulnerable to this. If so, they will cling to our differences and we will become the others. So there is a fear of stigma that will come after the stories have been shared. In line with this, you will see that in some circles, persons living with disabilities are called to be or regarded as people who are simply looking for attention. And in some cultures or in some societies, it's difficult to talk about sex or anything like that in line with persons living with disabilities because of the prevailing assumption that they are asexual. So those are some of the challenges that I have been able to identify. And more to that, there's been the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic on the rights of persons living with disabilities. It is evident that the COVID-19 pandemic has pronounced the vulnerabilities of persons living with disabilities in regard to access to healthcare services. The pandemic has heightened the exposure of persons living with disabilities to sexual violence. It can be noted that there's been exclusion as the healthcare services have been under pressure. Very little attention has been given to persons living with disabilities in this season of the COVID-19 pandemic, and that is something that has to be addressed. So I'm looking at a subtopic called substituted decision-making and denial of personal autonomy. And I'll give you a historical context of where this all comes from and on such as issues as compulsory sterilization. We see that persons living with disabilities are entitled to make their own decisions as people who have to exercise autonomy. But historically, we have seen that they've been segregated and pulled out of the community and were always isolated because they were deemed not to be kept among the able-bodied people in society. So in the US, compulsory sterilization of disabled people used to take place in the prisons in the 1907 and 1960s. And over 60,000 people were sterilized, and 2/3 of those people were women. And compulsory sterilization is unwanted or non-consensual sterilization of men and women. And we can see that it's a violation of their rights. And in this regard, there was a first law in Indiana in 1907. It was passed by Governor Frank J. Handley, and it gave a way forward for mandatory sterilization. And the aim of this was being driven by a notion known as eugenics. And eugenics believe that the human race can be improved by controlling reproduction as a way of cleansing the human gene pool of negative or less desirable traits found in less desirable people, particularly those with developmental disabilities, mental illness, or those who are considered immoral or had criminal histories. So there was this scientific thought and understanding that was going through that persons who were not well able-bodied had to be eliminated or prevented from giving birth so that those who are well able-bodied can continue to live. Whether this has continued to exist in this time, although some people continue to argue that it has gone with the time of Hitler, is a question up for discussion, because you can still see that in society, there are still people who carry out the forceful sterilization of people who are not well able-bodied or according to their understanding, and denying them personal autonomy and denying them the right to make their own decisions about their welfare. There is a case of Buck versus Bell, and it set a legal precedent that states at that time could sterilize inmates of public institutions. And they were looking at imbecility, epilepsy, and feeble-mindedness. And the argument was that this was hereditary and there was a potential of it to be passed on to other generations. Another case of Skinner versus Oklahoma challenged this decision. And although it did not directly address the issue of forced sterilization of people with disabilities, its reasoning undermines the rationale of Buck versus Bell, and it has been cited in subsequent cases denying petitions by guardians of people with disabilities, and has led to the enactment of procedural safeguards before sterilization of people in institutional settings. So we can see that there is a historical context in these two cases that shows that there is a belief that certain people should not continue to exist, that they should not reproduce because they are considered not to be in the status that they perceive is okay to have a lineage out of them, which is not right. So what are the recommendations that I bring forth considering this? One, there is need to empower persons living with disabilities to make autonomous decisions about their sexuality. Persons living with disabilities should be encouraged and empowered to decide for themselves for what they need. And then where there is need to vouch for supported decision-making models, which aid.
Sorry, Ms. Murungi, kindly wrap up. Time is about to.
Yes. Okay. And then we need to engage in campaigns that promote positive sexuality among people that live with disabilities, adopt a human rights-based approach towards sexual and reproductive rights of persons living with disabilities, and lastly, to raise awareness on the rights of persons living with disabilities. We need to play our part in changing attitudes about disabilities and to ensure that there is more sensitization. Conclusively, I would say that I would like to quote Hubert H. Humphrey, who said that the moral test of government is how that government treats those who are in the dawn of life, the children, those who are in the twilight of life, the elderly, and those who are in the shadows of life, the sick, the needy, and the persons living with disabilities. It's a call for all of us to play our part in promoting the rights of persons with disabilities. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Ms. Murungi, for that wonderful presentation. Ms. Murungi has defined the right to sexual and reproductive autonomy. She has also talked about the barriers on access to sexual and reproductive health. She has also referred us to international law on sexual and reproductive health of rights of persons with disabilities. She has also talked about implementation of international laws in Kenya and Uganda through various government agencies and legislation. To our panelists, there is one quick question which I wish you to address, and it has been asked by one of the participants. How may we better balance the heightened risk of sexual abuse experienced by persons with disabilities with the safe exercise of sexuality within communities? To our presenters.
I'm happy to take a stab at answering that. And to say that it's a non-answer. I don't think that we've achieved a kind of full enough understanding of what it takes to balance rights and responsibilities. But I think that a really important place to start is also not with overestimating vulnerability. So I think language can play a big role here. And I think the way that we speak about people with disabilities needs to recognize agency and needs to acknowledge and kind of remove paternalistic language and paternalistic understandings of disability, which see it as being, something which can be equated with being childlike or being ill, because there's a huge distinction. And there can be, and I think that in order to kind of shift things, one of the places is to recognize the agency and the rights and the responsibilities of people with disabilities themselves, and create as empowering an environment as possible. But simultaneously, there are obviously there's always going to be the need to recognize, I don't like the word vulnerability, right? Because it situates the difficulty in people with disabilities, but recognize the environmental things which can make it dangerous or difficult to live your sexual life as a person with a physical disability. But I think a really good place to start is to recognize where there's a tendency to be patronizing and try to redress that as best possible.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hunt. Now that marks the end of this session. Thank you for paying attention. I wish to hand over to Diana.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul, for that. I think, and thank you as well to both our presenters, Dr. Hunt and also Advocate Murungi. At this stage, we'll take a health break. If there are no further questions, we'll take a health break until 12 o'clock. So I'll just ask that we return at 12 o'clock to proceed with the rest of the presentations for the day. Thank you.